It is a curious and little-known fact of Canadian life, this article begins, that four powerful Detroit television stations are among the ties that bind this country together. Perhaps this fact is little known to many of you too, but the magic of satellite transmission in cable television had turned Detroit into a cultural beacon, an unlikely Canadian role model, this article continues, due to a remarkable Canadian success story. The growth of the Canadian Satellite Communications, or CANCOM, formed in 1981 to extend cable television service to remote and underserved regions of Canada. To many of these communities, the news might as well come from the moon. Detroit is by far the biggest US city to lie right on the Canadian border. With Windsor, it is the only metropolitan area to straddle the border, the most southerly metropolitan area in Canada. While Niagara Falls, Ontario, and New York can be cast as relative equals facing each other east-west, Detroit looms large over Windsor. Most oddly, through a kink in the way the river forms the borderline here, Detroit lies to the north of Windsor. The border is upside down. The story of CanCom on the surface recounts yet another Canadian media monopoly, profiting as a colonizing conduit for American culture. But it is also the story of how all of Canada became a little like Windsor, at least when sitting at their televisions. Windsor always had a unique media relationship to Detroit. My collaborator Sandra Gabriel describes Detroit's Sunday papers as so entrenched on the south side of the river that Windsor was uniquely exempt from Ontario's Lord's Day Act, for fear of swamping the ferries to the American side in pursuit of comic supplements. Electronic communications across the river began a sesquicentenary before CanCom's satellite uplink. In 1857, the first successful submarine telegraph was laid here, using a piece of cable originally intended for the transatlantic line. While new bridges and tunnels and cables celebrated friendship, cooperation, and free trade across the border, these conduits merely extended the ferrying of goods, people, soldiers, and slaves that had been happening long before mass media. The Underground Railroad metaphorically transported its migrants decades before actual railroad tunnels and gas pipelines went under the river here. Indeed, vigilant policing of the tunnel trade long predates our present crisis over immigration, evident, for example, in a 1908 complaint that Chinese migrants from Windsor were making unauthorized use of the tunnel as a right-of-way and facilities of great international line of railroad. Detroit was still a station on the Underground Railroad, and that wasn't stated with pride. In contrast, excitement accompanied Detroit radio across the river. Some of the earliest and most powerful radio broadcast signals emanated from WWJ and WCX, stations operated by the Detroit News and Detroit Free Press, soon anchors of the twin NBC radio networks for the region. The local CBS station changed its call letters here to WXYZ, not Z, in 1930, to finish the chain begun in New York by WABC. Easy access to Detroit's mass culture put a lag on the arrival of media in Windsor. Cable television arrives here last among large Canadian cities. Unsurprising, given there was really no need for it. Cinema, too, came later to Windsor than almost anywhere in Canada, even behind small villages across the prairies. Although moving pictures, in a sense, actually debut in Canada here, if you count Detroit as a Canadian city. Similarly, here in Windsor is where the first commercial television transmissions were received in Canada. You guessed it, from Detroit. When commercial television began in Detroit and Buffalo in 1948, daily television from the US became an option for many Canadians, but only if you lived right on the border, as the Financial Post explained. The first person plural in this question here, why have we no television, was Toronto. And the missing kind of television was American network programs. The question really was, if Windsor can get US TV, why not us? Although Marshall McLuhan had left Toronto by the debut of television in Windsor, his time teaching in Windsor included lectures on popular culture, sometimes held in Detroit. Now, it is fanciful but easy to imagine his ideas on the global village percolating while listening to a Notre Dame football game on WXYZ radio while sitting at home in another country. Funded by Detroit's own Ford Foundation, discussing the assembly line of cultural production, the Toronto Seminars in Communication and Culture in the 1950s expanded McLuhan's ideas about advertising into the ether of TV. He already made the point that newspaper circulation sought a monopoly of knowledge based on the conquest of space, as opposed to one based on the conquest of time. The idea is to reach as many people as possible in as short as time as possible. Now, in 1951, he cited television, comics, movies, and modern advertising as influences which were replacing printing. More interesting is a hint that the global village began as a global metropolis. Late in 1952, McLuhan claimed that large-scale mechanization had turned the entire globe into a city. The telegraph, the radio, the press, and the movies had made this a one-day world, he said. Television presents the total human gesture. But was Detroit the city he was thinking of? How ironic that his voice was broadcast over to Detroit from Windsor's CBC radio affiliate as he lectured coast to coast in 1953. Irony again when an early Canadian Press Newswire story quoted him accusing the very same CBC of being ashamed of radio and TV. Irony also that an early Globe and Mail profile was imported from the US from the New York Times wire service. We can watch whole cultures, the postures of whole societies, including our own. Information moves around the clock and around the world in an instantaneous, simultaneous fashion. The term global village appears in the mainstream soon after, telegraphed again across the border from the Globe and Mail's Washington Bureau Desk column, The US and Us. Modern media, such as television, gave this quality of simultaneity to events in the global village. The simultaneous sharing of experiences, as in a village or tribe, creates a village or tribal outlook and puts a premium on togetherness. In 1967, at the height of his celebrity, McLuhan was on the jury to choose the name Anik for Canada's communication satellites, just as the actual capacity to produce a global media village came to fruition with the One World simulcast. An earlier CP Wire story had already explained how the Canadian government is reported seeking an active role in the establishment of a global star telephone network. In time, your television screen may bring you an African tribal dance, Japanese geisha girls, or Australian football matches telecast live. Television viewers will be able to see more direct broadcast programs from all over Canada than is now possible. And the far north will be blanketed with television programs. Curiously, American television, the primary content that would eventually make this all profitable, is entirely absent from this early idealistic promise. American rebroadcasting was also absent from a 1967 proposal by CHTH Television in Hamilton and Montreal Telemedia, the same companies that later backed CanCom, to create a second private television network in Canada through satellite links. The point of nationally owned satellites was actually based on communication within Canada's borderlines. Nobody considered how easy it was to watch Detroit TV in Windsor, nor generally how many Canadians could already watch American channels through a simple set of rabbit ears. By 1973, the CRTC had begun to focus on television ads, proposing to substitute Canadian channels anytime a show was simultaneously broadcast on an American channel. SimSub served the status quo well, but it meant satellite TV fell behind in Canada. By 1980, hundreds of private television stations existed across the Arctic and remote communities. An operator in northern BC, almost in the Yukon, said the people of Cassiar won't stand for their TV service being taken away to please the lawmakers in Ottawa. Enter Rolf Hugin, president of Canadian Satellite Communications of Whitehorse, who told the same hearing he wants to rent a channel on the NIC3 satellite to bring the signals of television stations to northern communities. Hugin's Canadian Satellite Communications fronted a $22 million partnership with the originators of the satellite network idea from years before, Montreal Telemedia, CHCH in Hamilton, but now also BC TV's CHAN and Edmonton CITV. For $4 a month, the proposal was CanCom would provide TV and radio to the remote parts of Canada through NIC3. But it wasn't profitable. CanCom quickly cried poor, eyeing the launch of NIC-D, and petitioned to provide Detroit stations uplinked from Windsor, arguing Canadians should have virtually equal access to foreign television signals. It will equalize viewing opportunities in rural and urban areas. The Globe and Mail would later remark, cultural nationalists living in the South may quibble about whether an inability to see the best and worst of American entertainment is really deprivation, but there is no such doubt in the minds of CanCom's president. Prairie cable providers wanted to replace poor quality reception from North Dakota with Detroit. In CRTC hearings, skepticism whether anything that happens in Detroit makes much sense to the people of Saskatchewan crystallized into the idea that American television needed to hold a community of interest with its regional Canadian audience. At this stage, however, the CRTC accepted the terms of technical quality and increased profit margins for CanCom. Similar decisions led to Detroit replacing Syracuse in Eastern Ontario, stations from Bangor, Maine across the Atlantic, Spokane TV stations in rural Alberta, among many others coast to coast. CanCom's profits grew, and SimSub protected Canadian advertising revenues. Hardest hit were actually border area PBS stations in the US, reliant on pledge drives. And this Associated Press story, telegraphed back home to Canada too, portrayed creeping CanConism as a Canadian Goliath against border area PBS Davids. The association of Detroit with crime and violence, sparked by the 1968 race riots, got new terminology in the New York Times in 1971. When a wire service story about homicide figures began with the clever turn of phrase, the Motor City is rapidly earning a new title, the Murder City. In Canada, a decade later, the cliche became ammunition to take a stab at and later to kill CanCom's Detroit signals. Arthur Black, CBC broadcaster, wrote a Southern Chain column about how Detroit television programming bombards Canada and leaves cultural shell holes in places that are thousands of miles beyond the city's limits. One of the sleaziest metropolises this continent can dish up, Detroit is overcrowded, gang-ridden, slum-infested. That's why they call it the Murder City. The opposing point of view was given by CanCom Vice President Sheila Whitaker, who is quoted putting a positive spin on it. Detroit is so foreign that it is broadening. There are communities in Canada where the kind of racial profile of Detroit is totally unfamiliar. Suffice to say, this rebuttal rang hollow, given the company's growing profit margins. By 1994, the cries grew louder to replace Detroit. A columnist in the Regina Leader Post wrote, It's there every night on your TV screen, an alien world of random violence, a glimpse into a post-industrial reality of decaying factories and blighted urban landscapes, scorched by fire, embellished with bullet holes. Because of the basic differences between Detroit and Saskatchewan, Detroit TV is just not that relevant to local viewers. There's nothing, really, in terms of commonality. Finally, a pundit in the Regina Sun, Minneapolis simply has more in common with Regina, geographically, ethnically, attitudinally. Detroit, on the other hand, is an open sore masquerading as a home for 1 million people. The CRTC will soon hear applications for new channels that would provide American programming that has more in common with the lives of Reginians. Detroit's broadcast, on the other hand, would go over big in Rwanda. Just think. Invoking that comparison between Detroit and the brutal tragedy of genocidal civil war in Africa, Whitaker's tepid call for multiracial awareness was completely rejected. That phrase, community of interest, resurfaced from a decade earlier, now embraced by the CRTC. CanCom kept its monopoly, but had to supply a choice of Boston, Syracuse, Minneapolis, and Seattle. Detroit lost its decade-long time slot as Canada's media metropolis. Given a glimpse of what it's like to be a little like Windsor, it turned out the rest of Canada didn't really want to live right on the border after all.